the city moved fast enough to forget people like her. Cars rushed past in endless streams, their headlights flickering like indifferent stars. Shoes struck pavement in hurried rhythms, heels, boots, sneakers, each step belonging to someone with somewhere to be, someone who mattered to someone else. Conversations blended into a distant hum. Laughter echoed, then disappeared. Life, loud and restless, surged forward without ever looking down. She sat on the edge of it all, just outside the current. Her coat, once a soft gray, had faded into a color that matched the dust and concrete around her. It hung loosely on her frame, sleeves frayed at the edges, as if time itself had been pulling at the threads. A thin scarf wrapped around her neck, not for warmth anymore, but out of habit, something familiar in a life where everything else had slipped away. Most people didn't notice her, and when they did, they looked away quickly, as if acknowledging her existence might slow them down. She had learned not to expect anything different. At her feet sat a small, worn bag. Not a cup, not a sign. She wasn't asking for anything. No cardboard plea, no desperate gestures. Just her, sitting quietly on a cold stretch of sidewalk, like a shadow that had forgotten how to move. But every so often, she would lift her head slightly, and she would sing, not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention. Her voice slipped into the air gently, almost like she was afraid it might break if she pushed it too hard. It wasn't a performance. There was no audience, no expectation of applause or coins. She didn't even look up to see if anyone was listening, because no one ever did. Her voice was soft at first, barely rising above the noise of the city. It wove between passing footsteps and distant horns, fragile but steady. The kind of sound you might miss if you weren't already searching for it. A man in a suit brushed past her, his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't slow down. A group of teenagers walked by, one of them glancing over before whispering something. That made the others laugh. Someone dropped a few coins nearby, but not for her. They had simply fallen from a careless hand, rolling away until they disappeared into a crack in the pavement. She kept singing. There was something unusual about her voice, though no one stopped long enough to realize it. It carried a depth that didn't match her quiet presence. Beneath the softness was a weight, an ache that felt lived in, like every note had been shaped by something she had lost and never found again. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. A gust of wind passed through the street, tugging at her coat and lifting strands of her hair across her face. She didn't stop. Her eyes stayed lowered, focused somewhere far beyond the ground in front of her, as if she were seeing a different place entirely. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere kinder. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, the noise of the city seemed to bend around her voice. A woman walking by slowed her pace slightly, her expression shifting as if she had almost heard something worth noticing. But then her phone buzzed, and the moment broke. She kept moving. The spell, if it had ever existed, dissolved back into the chaos. Still, she sang. Because singing was the only thing she had left that felt like her. Not the cold nights. Not the empty mornings. Not the way people looked through her like she wasn't there. None of that belonged to who she had once been. But this quiet melody slipping from her lips, this was something no one had taken from her, even if no one heard it. Even if no one cared. Her voice rose just slightly, trembling on a note that held longer than the others. There was something in it. Something that hinted at a past that didn't match the present. A past where she hadn't been invisible. Where her voice might have filled rooms instead of getting lost on sidewalks. But the moment passed, just like all the others. A car horn blared. Someone shouted across the street. Laughter erupted nearby. and her song faded back into the noise of a city that never stopped long enough to listen. She lowered her head again, her voice softening, almost disappearing. Yet she kept singing, not for them, for herself. Because as long as she could still sing, she hadn't completely disappeared. The city moved fast enough to forget people like her. Cars rushed past in restless waves, their headlights slicing through the evening like cold, indifferent eyes. The sidewalks were alive with motion, people brushing past one another, shoulders bumping, voices overlapping, each person locked inside their own world. No one stopped, no one slowed. In a place where everything demanded attention, she had somehow become invisible. She sat at the edge of the sidewalk, where the concrete met the curb, as if even the city itself had quietly pushed her aside. Her coat hung loosely over her shoulders, worn thin by time and weather. Once it might have been warm, comforting even, but now it was just fabric, something between her and the cold air that crept in without permission. Strands of her hair clung to her face, tangled and windswept, but she didn't bother fixing them. There was no reason to. No one was looking. At her side rested a small, faded bag. It carried everything she owned, though it didn't look like much. There was no cup placed in front of her, no sign asking for help. She wasn't begging. Not anymore. Maybe she had once, but time had taught her that people rarely stopped long enough to care. So she stopped asking. Instead, she did the only thing she had left. She sang. Softly at first, almost like a whisper meant only for herself. The sound slipped out carefully, as if she were afraid it might shatter in the open air. It wasn't loud enough to compete with the city, but it didn't try to be. Her voice moved quietly through the noise, weaving between footsteps and passing conversations, fragile but steady. It wasn't for money, it wasn't for attention, it was survival. A man hurried past, adjusting his tie, eyes glued to the glowing screen in his hand. He didn't notice her. A couple walked by laughing, their voices bright and careless, their world untouched by the one sitting just inches away from them. One of them glanced in her direction briefly, just long enough to recognize what she was, before quickly looking away again. As if she didn't belong in the same frame. Her voice continued, unbroken. There was something in it, something most people never stayed long enough to feel. A quiet depth that didn't match the way she looked sitting there. Each note carried weight, like it had been shaped by years of something heavy, something unspoken. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was honest. A group of teenagers passed by, their energy loud and restless. One of them nudged another, nodding toward her with a smirk. A quick joke followed, soft but sharp enough to land. Laughter erupted, careless and fleeting, before they moved on like nothing had happened. She didn't react, didn't stop, didn't even look up. If it hurt, she had learned how to hide it well, burying it somewhere deep where even she didn't have to face it anymore. The wind picked up, rushing through the narrow street and carrying with it the scent of rain and asphalt. It tugged at her coat, slipped beneath the fabric, and wrapped itself around her like an unwelcome reminder of the night ahead. Still, she sang. Her eyes remained lowered, not focused on the ground, but somewhere far beyond it. Somewhere only. She could see. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was a place she used to belong. There was a faint shift in her expression as her voice lifted slightly, holding on to a note just a little longer than before. For a brief moment, something changed. Not in the city, but in her. The note carried a quiet power, trembling with emotion that didn't belong on a cold sidewalk. It hinted at something more, something hidden beneath the layers of exhaustion and silence, a voice that, in another life, might have filled rooms instead of disappearing into open air. A woman walking past slowed, just slightly. Her steps faltered, her head turning a fraction as if she had almost heard something worth stopping for. something real. But then her phone vibrated. The moment broke. She kept walking. And just like that, the world moved on again. Her voice softened, slipping back into the background, nearly lost beneath the hum of engines and distant sirens. The city reclaimed its noise, swallowing her song without a trace. But she didn't stop. Because this quiet, fragile melody, was the only thing that reminded her she was still here, still something, still human. Even if no one else noticed, even if no one ever listened. Night crept in slowly, not with silence, but with a different kind of noise. The city didn't rest. It just changed its rhythm. The golden glow of streetlights replaced the fading daylight, stretching long shadows across the pavement. Neon. Signs flickered to life, painting the sidewalks in shifting colors. The air grew colder, sharper, slipping through fabric and settling into bones. She felt it immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her coat, pulling it closer, though it barely made a difference. The cold had a way of finding her no matter what she did. It always did. Still, she didn't move. People continued to pass, though they were different now. Fewer suits, more hurried steps. Faces tired from long days, conversations shorter, laughter less frequent. Some walked alone, lost in thought. Others stayed close together, seeking warmth in numbers. None of them stopped. Her voice, though soft, carried just enough to exist in the spaces between everything else. It wasn't strong, but it was steady, like a small flame refusing to go out despite the wind pressing against it. She closed her eyes for a moment as she sang, and for the first time that night, the city disappeared. Not completely, but enough. The noise dulled, the cold softened. The ground beneath her no longer felt like concrete, but something distant, unimportant. Her voice shifted slightly, growing fuller, richer, as if something inside her had unlocked. A memory, perhaps. Or a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to touch in a long time. The note she held this time didn't tremble. It stretched, smooth and controlled, carrying an emotion that didn't belong to someone the world had forgotten. It belonged to someone who had once been seen, once been heard. And just for a second, it showed. A man walking his dog slowed down. Not much, just enough for his steps to lose their rhythm. His head tilted slightly, brows pulling together in quiet confusion. He couldn't quite place what he was hearing, but something about it felt different, real. The dog tugged forward, impatient, breaking the moment. The man shook it off and kept walking. She never noticed. Her eyes remained closed, her voice rising gently before falling again, like a tide guided by something deeper than thought. There were no lyrics anyone nearby could clearly understand, just fragments, soft and distant. But the emotion was unmistakable. It was longing, not loud, not desperate, but quiet and endless. A car slowed at a nearby light, music thumping faintly from inside. For a brief second, her voice blended with it, two completely different worlds colliding in the same space. Then the light turned green and the car sped off, taking the moment with it. Everything passed. Everything moved on. Everything except her. Her voice softened again, dipping back into the edges of silence. The strength that had surfaced only moments ago faded, retreating into something safer, smaller. Like she had revealed too much without meaning to. Like the world wasn't meant to hear that part of her anymore. A couple approached from across the street, their conversation low and serious. As they passed, the woman glanced down at her, her expression unreadable. For a split second, their eyes nearly met. Nearly. But the woman looked away first. They kept walking. It was always like that. Almost moments. Almost seen. Almost heard. Almost something. but never enough. The wind picked up again, colder now, slipping through the spaces between buildings and wrapping around her like a quiet warning. The night would only get harsher from here. She knew that. Her voice grew quieter, but it didn't stop. Because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering. And remembering was something she couldn't afford tonight. So she kept singing. Not for the people who passed her, not for the ones who laughed or ignored or almost listened, but for herself. Because in a world that had erased her piece by piece, this was the only thing that still felt untouched. Her voice lingered in the air for a moment after each note, delicate and fleeting, before disappearing completely, like it had never been there at all. Just like her. And still, no one truly heard. The night deepened, and with it came a heavier kind of silence, one that lived beneath the noise. The crowds had thinned now. The rush of the evening had passed, leaving behind scattered footsteps and distant echoes. Streetlights hummed softly. Above, casting pale circles on the pavement, each one like a small stage no one had asked to stand on. She hadn't moved from hers. Her body ached in ways she no longer tried to fix. There was a stiffness in her shoulders, a dull weight in her chest, and a quiet exhaustion that sleep never seemed to touch. Still, she remained where she was, as if leaving would mean giving up something she wasn't ready to lose. Her voice drifted out again, softer now, worn at the edges. But still there. Each note came with effort, yet it carried something deeper than strength. It carried memory. Not clear memories, not full images, just pieces, a flicker of light, a sound of applause, distant, fading, a feeling, warm, bright, almost impossible to hold on to. Her voice wavered slightly. For a moment, it almost broke. But she caught it. She always did. A lone figure passed by on the opposite side of the street, hands buried in his coat pockets. His pace slowed just a fraction as her voice reached him, not loud, not demanding, but different enough to slip through the cracks of his thoughts. He glanced over, just briefly. Long enough to see her sitting there, small against the vast stretch of concrete, her head slightly bowed, her lips moving with quiet precision. There was something about the way she sang, not for anyone, not even for herself in a conscious way, that made it feel real. Unfiltered. He hesitated. Then a car passed between them, its headlights washing over the street, breaking the moment, into fragments of light and shadow. When it was gone, so was his attention. He kept walking. She never noticed. Her voice dipped lower, almost fading into nothing, before rising again with a fragile determination. It wasn't strength that kept her going. It was habit. The kind that forms when something becomes the only thread holding you together. The city had taken a lot from her. Time, comfort, dignity. But it hadn't taken this. Not yet. A faint shiver ran through her as the cold settled deeper into the night. Her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her coat, as if trying to hold onto warmth that wasn't there. Her breath became visible now, small clouds forming and disappearing with every exhale. Still, she sang through it. Her voice carried a quiet ache tonight, more than before. There was something building beneath it, something close to the surface, but never fully breaking through, like a story that refused to be told, no matter how badly it wanted to be heard. A distant siren echoed through the streets, rising and falling like a ghost passing by. It blended with her voice for a moment, creating a strange harmony that felt both haunting and beautiful. Then it faded. Everything always faded. Her song slowed, the notes stretching longer, thinner, as if they were growing tired alongside her. Each breath became more deliberate, more fragile. It would have been easy to stop now. No one would notice. No one ever did. But she didn't stop. because stopping meant silence, and silence was worse. A man emerged from a nearby building, adjusting his jacket as he stepped into the cold. He paused at the curb, waiting for the light to change. His gaze drifted without intention, across the street, down the sidewalk, until it landed on her. He frowned slightly, not out of judgment, but confusion. He could hear something soft, almost hidden beneath the hum of the city. Her voice. He leaned his head just a little, as if trying to catch it more clearly. For a brief second, the noise around him seemed to fall away, leaving only that fragile melody hanging in the air. And in that second, something shifted. Not enough to stop him, not enough to change anything, but enough to feel it. Then the light changed. A car honked behind him. The moment snapped. He crossed the street, the sound fading with each step he took. She was alone again, completely. Her voice slipped into a softer register, barely more than a whisper now. The strength from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to surrender. But not quite. Because even now, on the edge of fading, there was still something in it, something real, something that refused to disappear completely. Her final note lingered longer than the rest, trembling slightly as it hung in the cold air. It carried everything she couldn't say, everything she had lost, everything she still held on to without knowing why. Then it fell. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just quietly, like it had never been there at all. She lowered her head again, her lips pressing together as the silence returned. The city filled the space instantly, swallowing the last trace of her voice without hesitation. Another moment gone, another song unheard, and yet, deep beneath the exhaustion, beneath the cold and the quiet acceptance, something still remained. A small, stubborn piece of her that refused to let go. Even if the world already had, the silence that followed felt heavier than the cold. For a while, she didn't sing. Her head remained lowered, her gaze fixed somewhere near her hands, though she wasn't really seeing anything. The city continued around her, distant footsteps, the low rumble of engines, voices passing in fragments, but it all felt farther away now, like it belonged to a different world. Her world had grown smaller, quieter. She drew in a slow breath, the air sharp against her chest, and let it out just as carefully. Her fingers shifted slightly, stiff from the cold, brushing against the worn fabric of her coat as if grounding herself in something real. There had been a time, she couldn't remember exactly when silence meant peace. Now, it only meant emptiness. Her lips parted again, almost instinctively, and the song returned. This time, it was different. Softer, yes, but not fragile. In the same way. There was a steadiness to it now, something quieter but deeper, like she had stopped trying to hold anything back. The notes came slower, more deliberate, each one carrying weight without needing to rise above the noise around her. She wasn't trying to be heard. Not anymore. She was simply letting it exist. A faint tremor moved through her voice, but it didn't break. If anything, it made the sound more real, more human. There was no perfection in it, only truth. And somehow, that made it stronger. A figure approached from down the sidewalk, walking at an unhurried pace. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at his phone. His hands were tucked into his coat, his gaze moving quietly across the street as if he had nowhere urgent to be. As he drew closer, something caught his attention. Not immediately, just a shift in the air. A sound that didn't quite belong to the rhythm of everything else. He slowed slightly, her voice. It reached him not as noise, but as something separate. Something that didn't demand to be heard but lingered just enough to make ignoring it feel like a choice. He didn't stop walking, but he didn't tune it out either. There was a subtle change in his expression, barely noticeable, but real. His eyes moved toward her, studying the small figure sitting at the edge of the sidewalk, wrapped in layers that did little to protect her from the night. He took in the details quietly: the worn coat, the stillness, the way she sang without looking up. No performance, no expectation, just presence. Most people would have kept going. He almost did. But something in her voice held him there, not physically, but just enough to slow his steps again. There was a depth to it, something unpolished but undeniable, like a story told without words. He had heard voices like that before, rare ones. The kind that didn't come from training alone, but from living. She didn't notice him. Her eyes remained lowered, her voice steady, drifting into the cold air as if it had nowhere else to go. The world around her could have disappeared entirely, and she might not have known. Or maybe she simply wouldn't have cared. The man stood, there for a moment longer than anyone else had that night. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to listen. Really listen. A car passed behind him, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene before fading again. The light brushed across her face for just a second, revealing something beneath the exhaustion. Not youth, not age, but history. Something lived, something lost, something still holding on. Her voice lifted slightly, catching on a note that carried more emotion than anything before it. It wasn't louder, but it reached further. It filled the small space between them in a way the city couldn't drown out. And in that moment, he felt it. Not just heard it. Felt it. His brow tightened just slightly, not in confusion, but recognition. Like he had stumbled upon something he wasn't expecting, but somehow understood. Still, he didn't speak. Didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, caught between moving on and staying, and for the first time that night, she wasn't completely unheard. The moment stretched, quiet and fragile, like something that could disappear if either of them moved too quickly. She didn't know he was still there. Her voice continued in soft, steady waves, each note drifting into the cold air and settling somewhere unseen. There was no hesitation in her anymore, no effort to shape or control the sound. She had let go of that. What remained was something simpler, something truer. The man stood a few steps away now, close enough to hear every subtle shift in her voice, close enough to understand it. He watched her for a moment longer, his gaze steady but not intrusive. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment. Just a quiet focus, as if he were trying to piece together something that didn't quite make sense. A voice like that didn't belong here. And yet, there she was, alone, unnoticed, singing to a world that had already decided not to listen. His head tilted slightly, almost unconsciously, as she held a note longer than expected. It trembled, not from weakness, but from something deeper. Something carried. Something earned. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold. Then, after a brief pause, he stepped closer. The sound of his shoes against the pavement was soft, but in her world, where everything else had faded, it was enough. Her voice faltered, just slightly. Not enough to stop, but enough to shift. She opened her eyes. For a second, she didn't. Look at him. Her gaze lifted only halfway, as if expecting nothing. As if every interruption before had taught her not to hope for anything different. But he didn't walk past. He didn't look away. He stopped. And when her eyes finally met his, something unfamiliar passed between them. Not recognition. Not yet. just presence. Real, undeniable presence. Her voice faded, the last note slipping quietly into the air between them before disappearing completely. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It felt held. She studied him briefly, guarded, uncertain. People didn't stop. They passed by, glanced, ignored. Sometimes they spoke, but never like this, never with stillness. Her fingers tightened slightly against her coat. "Sorry," she said softly, her voice rougher now without the melody. "I didn't mean to." He shook his head gently, cutting her off before she could finish. "No," he said, his tone calm, steady. "Don't stop." The words weren't forceful. They didn't demand anything, but they carried weight. She hesitated. Her eyes searched his face, trying to understand what he meant. There was no mockery there, no impatience, no discomfort, just sincerity. It confused her. "I wasn't—" she started, then paused, unsure how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "I'm not performing." "I know," he replied. A small silence settled between them again. The city continued in the background, cars passing, distant voices, the low hum of everything that never stopped. But here, in this small space, it felt quieter, focused. "You have a voice," he said after a moment. Not as a compliment. Not casually, but like a fact he had just discovered. She looked away. Her shoulders shifted slightly, almost instinctively closing in on themselves. "It's nothing," she murmured. "Just something I do." "For money?" he asked. She shook her head immediately. "No." The answer came quicker than anything else she had said. He noticed. There was something in that response, something firm, almost protective. As if the idea itself didn't belong to what she was doing. He nodded slightly, understanding more than she had explained. Another pause. The kind that usually led to people leaving. But he didn't move. Instead, he looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. Taking in the details others ignored. The wear in her clothes, the exhaustion in her posture, the quiet strength in the way she held herself despite everything. And beneath all of it, that voice. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated again. It had been a long time since anyone had asked. Long enough that the question itself felt unfamiliar. "Lena?" she said finally, her voice almost uncertain, like she wasn't sure if it still belonged to her. He gave a small nod, as if committing it to memory. "Lena?" he repeated. Something about the way he said it felt different, like it mattered. She glanced at him again, studying his face more carefully this time. There was something familiar about him, not obvious, not immediate, but something she couldn't quite place. Still, she didn't ask. People came and went. Names didn't change that. "Why did you stop?" he asked quietly. She frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. "I didn't," she said. I mean, before," he clarified. "Why did you stop singing like that?" Her expression shifted. For a moment, the guarded calm cracked just slightly. Not enough to break, but enough to reveal something underneath. Something she hadn't planned to show. Her gaze dropped again. "I didn't stop," she said, softer this time. "This is what's left." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything she had sung. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer sympathy. He just listened, really listened. And in that moment, something changed. Not in the city, not in the world around them, but here, on this cold stretch of sidewalk, where no one ever stopped. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't just hearing her voice. They were hearing her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt careful, like something fragile had just been uncovered and neither of them wanted to disturb it too quickly. The city still moved around them, indifferent as ever, but it no longer felt as loud. Lena shifted slightly, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The cold had settled deeper now, creeping into her fingers, her shoulders, her breath. But her attention wasn't on that anymore. It was on him. There was something unusual about the way he stood there. Most people carried urgency, even when they tried to hide it. Their eyes wandered, their bodies leaned forward, always ready to move on. He didn't. He was still, present. As if, for this moment, there was nowhere else he needed to be. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly, her voice almost blending into the air. It wasn't a dismissal, more like a habit, a way of protecting herself from expectations that never lasted. "I know," he replied. But he didn't leave. Her gaze lingered on him for a second longer before drifting away again. She wasn't used to this, someone choosing to remain without a reason she could see. "People don't usually stop," she added, almost to herself. "I'm not most people," he said simply. There was no arrogance in it, just truth. That caught her attention. Her eyes lifted again, studying him more carefully now. The calm in his voice, the ease in his posture, it didn't match the world she had come to expect. For a brief moment, that faint sense of familiarity returned, tugging at her thoughts. But still, she couldn't place it. "Why?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it carried more than curiosity. It held confusion, caution, a hint of disbelief. Why would anyone stop? Why would anyone listen? He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze shifted slightly, as if searching for the right words. Not something impressive, not something rehearsed, just something honest. "Because you meant it," he said finally. She frowned, not fully understanding. "What?" "When you were singing," he continued, his tone steady, "you weren't trying to be heard. You weren't asking for anything." He paused, then added softly, "That's rare." The words settled into the space between them. Lena looked away again, her jaw tightening just slightly. She didn't know what to do with that. Compliments, even quiet ones, felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. "It doesn't change anything," she murmured. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Another pause. "But it should," he added. Her eyes flickered back to his, sharper this time. There it was again, that strange feeling. Not hope. Not yet. But something close to it. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. It made her uneasy. "You don't know anything about me," she said, a bit more firmly now. Not defensive, just certain. He nodded slightly. "You're right." That was it. No argument, no attempt to prove her wrong, just acceptance. And somehow, that made it harder to dismiss him. The wind swept through the street again, colder now, carrying with it the distant echo of sirens and the rustle of loose paper skittering across the pavement. Lena shivered, her fingers curling tighter into her sleeves. He noticed. Without making it obvious, he stepped slightly to the side, blocking just enough of the wind to ease its edge where she sat. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But she felt it. Her eyes lifted again, this time lingering. "Why are you doing that?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Doing what?" "Staying, talking." She hesitated, then added, "Not looking away." There was no accusation in her tone, just quiet confusion. He considered the question for a moment. Then he gave the simplest answer. Because you're still here. The words caught her off guard. Something in her expression shifted, subtle, but real. As if those 4 words had reached somewhere deeper than anything else he had said. Still here. Not forgotten. Not invisible. Still here. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For a moment, the city felt very far away. You said this is what's left, he continued gently, referring to her singing. That means there was more. Her gaze dropped instantly. The fragile opening closed just as quickly as it had appeared. There was, she said quietly. He waited, but she didn't continue. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, filled with things she wasn't ready to say. He didn't push. Didn't ask more. Instead, after a moment, he spoke again, carefully. She didn't answer him right away. The question, no, the suggestion, lingered between them, heavier than it should have been. Sing again. It sounded simple. Too simple. Like he didn't understand what it meant for her to even try. Lena looked. Down at her hands, her fingers curled into the worn fabric of her sleeves. They felt colder now, or maybe she was just more aware of them. Her chest tightened slightly, a quiet pressure building beneath her ribs. No one listens, she said, almost under her breath. Not as an argument, just a truth she had learned too many times. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced around, not at the crowds rushing past, not at the glowing lights or the endless movement, but at the space itself, the small circle of sidewalk where she sat, the air that carried her voice, whether anyone noticed it or not. Then his gaze returned to her. I'm listening. It was a simple statement, but it didn't feel small. Something in her expression shifted again, barely noticeable, but real. Her jaw softened just slightly, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the flaw in what he had just said. People said things. They didn't mean them, or they didn't stay long enough for them to matter. You'll leave, she said quietly. Not bitter, not accusing, just certain. Eventually, he admitted. That answer surprised her. It wasn't what she expected. Most people would have promised otherwise, offered something comforting, something temporary. But he didn't. He told the truth, and somehow. That made her pause. But I'm here now, he added. The words settled deeper than they should have. Now. Not forever. Not later. Just now. The wind swept through again, softer this time, brushing past them without the same sharp edge. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Footsteps echoed. Briefly, then faded. The world kept moving. But this moment didn't. Lena exhaled slowly, her breath trembling just slightly in the cold air. Her shoulders rose and fell as if she were carrying something invisible, something heavy she didn't know how to set down. You don't understand, she said, her voice quieter now. It's not just singing. He didn't interrupt. She hesitated, then continued, the words coming slower, like they had to push their way out. It's remembering, she admitted. It's feeling things I don't want to feel anymore. Her eyes dropped again, her voice almost fading, at the edges. When I sing like that, it all comes back. There it was. Not the surface. The truth. He absorbed it without reacting, without trying to fix it. That doesn't make it weak, he said gently. It does here, she replied, a faint, humorless breath escaping her. Out here, you don't get to feel things. Not if you want to get through the night. He nodded slightly. I get that. And for a second, it sounded like he really did. Not in the same way. But enough. Silence followed again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything she had just said, and everything she hadn't. Her fingers loosened slightly against her coat. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked after a moment. "You don't know me." He held her gaze this time. "No," he said, "but I know what it sounds like when someone still has something left and doesn't believe it." The words landed quietly, but they stayed. Lena swallowed, her throat tightening slightly. She looked away again, but not as quickly as before. Something inside her was shifting, resisting, and leaning forward at the same time. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to open that door, because if he was wrong, if she tried and nothing changed, it would hurt more than the silence ever had. "I wouldn't even know where to start," she admitted, almost reluctantly. "You already did," he said. Her brows furrowed. "When?" He gave a small nod toward where she had been sitting. "Right there." She let out a soft breath, something between disbelief and exhaustion. "That's not the same." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Another pause. "But it's still real." The city noise swelled slightly, then dipped again, like a distant tide. A few people passed by, their footsteps echoing faintly before disappearing into the night. None of them stopped, none of them noticed, but for the first time, that didn't feel like the only truth anymore. Lena lifted her head just a little. Her eyes didn't meet his right away. Instead, they drifted forward, unfocused, like she was looking at something far beyond the street in front of her. Something internal. Something buried. Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. Fear. Doubt. Memory. They all moved through her at once, pulling her back, holding her in place. "I can't promise anything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I'm not asking you to." That answer lingered. No pressure, no expectations, just space. Slowly, very slowly, she straightened just a little where she sat. It wasn't much, but it was different. Less folded in, less hidden. Her hands relaxed in her lap. The air between them shifted again, subtle but undeniable. She drew in a breath. It caught halfway. She tried again. This time it steadied. For a moment she said nothing, did nothing. And then, very quietly, she began to sing.